I had been in the ballroom for exactly 17 minutes when I saw her, and in those 17 minutes I had eaten 1 canope, declined 2 drinks, and rehearsed approximately 4 versions of what I would say if I ran into anyone I knew. None of those rehearsals had accounted for Vivien Hart standing under a chandelier in a champagne-colored gown, laughing at something the woman beside her had said, looking exactly the way she had looked the night she told me she had been seeing someone else for 6 months. My champagne flute went cold against my fingers. Across the room, Selene Marchetti turned her head, found my face, and started walking toward me with the unhurried precision of a woman who had decided something. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. I had not wanted to come to this gala. I had told my publisher exactly that, 3 weeks ago in the small overheated office on the 14th floor, where my publisher conducted all difficult conversations, because the radiator made it uncomfortable enough that nobody wanted to extend them. I had said with the calm of a woman who had spent 6 months rebuilding a sense of self after a long and public dismantling, that I did not have the energy for a black-tie literary fundraiser, where every person in attendance would have read the New York Times piece about my novel, and approximately 40% of them would also have read the smaller, meaner piece. In a publication I refused to name about the dissolution of my engagement, my publisher had looked at me over her reading glasses and said with the same calm that the gala was not optional, that my novel was up for an award, that my absence would be read as either weakness or arrogance, and neither was a brand we wanted to build right now. So, I had bought the dress, black, long-sleeved, high-necked, the kind of dress that read as armor to anyone paying attention and as elegance to anyone who was not. I had pinned my hair up the way I pinned it up for readings, which was the version of myself I trusted most in public. I had taken a car service to the venue alone, because the alternative was asking someone to attend with me, and I had not yet identified anyone in my life I could ask without feeling that I owed them something afterward. I had walked into the ballroom with a clean spine and a steady hand, and I had eaten 1 canope, and I had declined 2 drinks, and I had been doing fine. And then there was Vivien, under the chandelier laughing. Vivien Hart had been my fiancée for 2 years and 3 months. She had ended our engagement on a Sunday in October by telling me over coffee at the kitchen island in the apartment we had bought together that she had been seeing the woman from her firm's London office for 6 months and was choosing to be honest about it now because she had decided to move there in the spring. The honesty had been in Vivien's framing a generosity. The 6 months had been, in Vivien's framing, a regrettable necessity she had needed to give herself permission to feel before she could communicate it. The woman from the London office had been with her at our engagement party in July. I had served her a slice of cake. It was a particular cruelty, the dress code of the gala, because it ensured that Vivien would look the way she had looked at the engagement party, composed and beautiful and unbothered. And it ensured that I would have to look at her looking that way, without any visible armor of my continuous own. I turned away from the chandelier with the kind of casual neck movement I had practiced. I located the nearest bar. I did not actually want a drink, but the bar was a destination, and a destination is what a woman who is being watched needs more than anything in a room she has not yet figured out how to exit. I had taken 3 steps when Selene Marchetti said my name. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was the way she said everything at exactly the volume the conversation required. No more, no less, calibrated for the specific acoustic of the room she was in. Saram, she said. I stopped. Selene was the CEO of the publishing house's parent company. I had met her exactly twice. The first time had been at the contract signing for my novel in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor, where she had sat across from me in a charcoal suit and had asked 3 questions about the book that had been more incisive than the questions any of the editors had asked over the course of the 18-month acquisition process. The second time had been at a quarterly author's luncheon, where she had stood at the back of the room and had not said a single word during the formal presentations, and had then, in the brief mingling period afterward, walked directly to me and asked me how the second draft was going, in a tone that suggested she had read the first one carefully. She was 41 years old. She was, professionally speaking, the most powerful woman in the building I worked in, which was a building I worked in only contractually, but still. She had a way of moving through rooms that made the rooms reorganize themselves around her, without her appearing to ask them to. She wore tonight what she had worn both other times I had seen her, which was a tailored suit black tonight, with a silk blouse the exact color of bone and a watch on her right wrist that caught the chandelier light once when she lifted her hand. Her hair was pulled back. It was always pulled back. I had decided sometime during the contract signing that this was the most disciplined hairstyle I had ever seen on a woman who was not being televised. I turned and met her eyes. "Selene," I said. She was 3 feet away, then 2. Then she was beside me, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Something quiet and expensive, cedar under citrus, the kind of scent that did not announce itself, but stayed with you afterward in a way you could not quite identify. "You look like you're heading somewhere," she said. "The bar," I said. She glanced toward the bar, then back at me. Her eyes were a gray that read brown in some light, and brown that read gray in others. And tonight, in the chandelier light, they were doing the gray version. "I'll walk with you," she said. This was not a question. It was also not a command. It was the thing Selene Marchetti said that I had begun to recognize in our 2 prior encounters as her particular grammatical construction, a statement of intent that allowed the person on the receiving end to refuse if they wanted to, while making clear that refusing would require an actual refusal. A sentence with a no in it, which was a sentence most people did not produce in time. I did not produce it in time. She fell into step beside me. The bar was about 30 feet away on the far side of a small clutch of foundation board members in evening wear who were laughing too loudly at something one of them had said. I navigated around them. Selene navigated around them in the half-step behind me that allowed me to set the pace without making either of us aware that she was doing it. I felt Vivien's attention before I saw it. There is a particular weight to being looked at by someone who used to know your body, and I felt it land between my shoulder blades approximately 4 feet before we reached the bar. I did not turn around. "What are you drinking?" Selene asked. "Sparkling water," I said. She lifted one finger to the bartender, who appeared in front of her in the way bartenders appear when they have correctly identified the most important person at their bar. Selene ordered the sparkling water and a glass of wine for herself. Her ordering was efficient and uncomplicated the way she did everything, and the bartender was gone again in 8 seconds with a small nod. Selene turned and put her back to the bar. Her shoulder was not touching mine. She was simply standing beside me at a slight angle that made it clear to anyone watching that we were together. Not in any romantic sense, just in the practical sense of 2 people who had arrived at the bar in the same conversation and had not yet ended it. She said quietly, "You should look at me when she walks over here." I went still. "I beg your pardon," I said. Selene did not look toward Vivien. Her eyes stayed on my face. The unhurried steadiness of a woman who had no doubt about what she had seen. "She is looking at you." Selene said she has been looking at you since you came in. She has spent the last 90 seconds talking to the woman beside her about something she is no longer interested in, and in approximately 2 minutes, she will excuse herself and walk over here because she has decided she needs to know whether you came alone. I stared at her. "How do you know that?" I said. "I have been watching the room." Selene said, "It is what I do at these events. I have not seen you watching the room. That is also what I do." The bartender returned with our drinks. Selene took her wine and turned slightly so that her body angled toward mine, which had the effect from across the room of placing me at the center of her attention in a way that was visually unmistakable to a third party, but did not actually involve any contact at all. I was very aware of how close she was standing. I said, "Why are you doing this?" She looked at me. The chandelier light on her face was doing something that made her look both younger and more deliberate, which was the kind of contradiction I had been trained by my own writing practice to notice. She said, "Because 6 weeks ago I read a piece about you in a publication I will not name, and I do not believe a person should have to walk into a room like this without someone beside them, and I am not making any other claim about it than that." I absorbed this. I said, "You read the piece. I read everything that touches the company." She said that piece did not touch the company. It touched my author. She said the word "my" did something specific in my chest. I catalogued it and refused to look at it directly. I said that is more than I expected from a CEO. "I am not a typical CEO," she said, and the corner of her mouth did something that might have been a smile if it had committed. I drank the sparkling water. The bubbles were doing their small useful work against the back of my throat. Across the room, I could feel Vivien's attention shift and shift again. And then I felt the specific moment where she made a decision because her conversation with the woman beside her ended visibly. A polite touch on the woman's arm, a half step away, a full step. "She is moving," I said quietly. "I see her," Selene said. Selene shifted her weight. It was a small motion, the kind of weight redistribution that happens when a person is preparing to do something specific. Her right hand, the one with the watch, moved from the bar to a point just behind me, not touching, just present. "The way a hand is present when a hand is about to be involved in something," she said very quietly. "Tell me now if this is not what you want." I looked at her. I had 4 seconds, maybe 5. Vivien was crossing the floor with the long, even stride she used when she had decided she was going to do something graceful in front of an audience. The smile on her face was the public smile, the one she had used on partners and clients and judges. The one that meant, "I am about to be charming at you in a way you cannot decline without being the rude one." I said, "This is what I want." So's hand moved. It went to my waist, just my waist. Not a grab, not a possession, just the warm flat of her palm at the curve where my dress sat against my hip. The contact specific and steady and entirely unambiguous to anyone watching. Her thumb stayed still. Her fingers did not press. It was the gesture of a woman who had no need to perform her certainty because the certainty was already there. It was the most contact I had experienced from another person in 6 months. I forgot how to breathe correctly for approximately 3 seconds. Vivien arrived. "Saram," she said. Her voice was bright and warm in the way she had perfected for difficult rooms. She was beautiful. I could acknowledge it without it costing me anything anymore, which was a piece of information I was going to need to sit with later. The champagne dress moved well. Her hair was different than it had been in October, shorter, more deliberate. London had been good to her in some surface ways, and I refused to begrudge her that. "Vivien," I said. I had not prepared a tone for her name. The tone that came out was the one I used for distant colleagues, neutral and unweed, and I was grateful to whatever part of myself had produced it without consultation. Vivien's eyes moved to Selene, the smile adjusted by some small percentage. "I don't think we've met," she said. "Selene," said Selene. Her voice was the one she used in the conference room. Surgical, no warmer or colder than was professionally appropriate. She did not extend her hand. The hand was occupied. Vivien's eyes flicked with a precision I remembered to the place where Solene's hand was sitting at my waist. "She is with me," Selene said. The sentence was short and complete. It did not editorialize. It did not perform. It was offered the way Selene offered everything as information, accurate and uncluttered, with the implication that arguing with the information was a waste of the room's time. Vivien's smile held. I knew this smile. It was the smile she used when she had been told something she had not expected, and had decided to absorb it without flinching. It was, professionally speaking, an extremely effective smile, and it was one of the things I had loved about her once, because it had meant she could handle difficult news without making the room hold her. I had loved a number of things about Vivien. None of them had survived October. "How nice," Vivien said. Her voice was perfectly calibrated. "To meet someone Saram is seeing." Selene did not respond to this. She did not confirm the framing or correct it. She looked at Vivien with the unhurried attention she had brought to the bar and waited for whatever Vivien was going to do next. Vivien, to her credit, recovered quickly. She turned her attention back to me. "You look well," she said. "Thank you," I said. "I read the Times piece. Congratulations on the book." "Thank you," I said again. I had a sentence I had been working on for 6 months in the small private editing room of my own head for exactly this conversation. I had drafted and redrafted it. I had a version that was cutting, and a version that was civil, and a version that was forgiving in a way that would have cost me nothing, because I had not actually forgiven anything. I had memorized all 3. I did not use any of them. I said, "Was there something you wanted, Vivien?" It was not cruel. It was just direct. The tone was the one I had practiced in the mirror of my new apartment for approximately 3 weeks before I had given up practicing and decided I would simply produce whatever came out. Vivien's smile did the small adjustment again. "I just wanted to say hello," she said. "You said it," I said. A small silence. Selene did not move. Her hand stayed exactly where it was. She did not look at Vivien with any particular hostility. She clear's throat looked at her with the steady, unaroused interest of a woman watching a scene she had correctly anticipated. Vivien said with the brightness slightly tighter, "It's good to see you doing well, Sam." I said, "Thank you for coming over." She turned. She walked back across the ballroom with the same long, even stride. The champagne gown moved. The woman she had been talking to under the chandelier looked up, and her face did the small thing faces do when they have been waiting for information and have just received it. I exhaled. It came out shaky. Celine's hand stayed at my waist for one more beat. Then, with the same unhurried grace she had done everything else with all evening, it moved away. I said, "I owe you a drink." She said, "You owe me nothing." I said, "I am buying you a drink anyway." She said, "I will accept the drink, but you do not owe me anything. I want you to be clear about that." I looked at her. She was looking at me with the same steady attention she had brought to the entire encounter. And now that the encounter was over, the attention did not redirect. She did not check the room. She did not look toward the rest of the gala. She looked at me, and I had the disorienting sense, sitting at the bar of a room I had not wanted to enter, that I had become for the duration of this conversation the only thing she was actually here for. I said, "Why did you do that?" She said, "I told you why. You told me partially." She conceded this with a small movement of her head. She said, "I do not like watching people be ambushed in rooms they did not choose to be ambushed in, particularly people whose work I respect, whose work you respect," I said. She said, "Yes, there is more." I said, "I was not asking. I was stating it. I was a writer. I knew the difference between a complete answer and an answer with the corners trimmed off." She said, "There is more. I am not going to tell you what the more is in the bar of a fundraiser. We have not earned that conversation yet." I said, she said. I am using the word loosely. I drank the sparkling water. My hand was steady on the glass. Across the room, Vivien had rejoined the woman in the champagne dress and was performing the recovery she had perfected, and I felt for the first time in 6 months that I had survived an encounter with her without losing anything. I said, "What do I do now?" Selene said, "You stay, you eat dinner. You attend the awards portion. You leave when you are ready." I said, "Will you stay?" She said, "I am already staying. I have a table. You may sit at it if you like, but you do not have to. Your publisher has placed you at table 14. I have asked. You can sit where you were assigned. Nothing about this evening requires you to do anything else." I looked at her. I said, "I would like to sit at your table." A pause. She said, "Good." She did not say anything else about it. She did not perform any reaction. She picked up her wine glass and took one careful sip and set it down again. And the simplicity of the gesture undid something in my chest that I had been carrying since the bar. We left the bar together. She did not put her hand back on my waist. She did not need to. The room had filed the information. Celine's table was at the front of the ballroom near the small stage where the awards would be given out later. There were 9 other people already seated when we arrived, and she introduced me to each of them by name and by a single descriptive sentence. The editor of a literary quarterly I admired, a board member of the foundation, a translator from the Spanish I had read twice. She did not introduce me as my author. She introduced me as Saram Voss, whose novel was nominated tonight and whose work she found exceptional. And then she sat down beside me without making any more of it. Dinner was served. The conversation around the table was the conversation that happened at literary tables, discursive and a little arch and self-aware about its own architecture. Selene contributed exactly enough to be a present participant, and not one syllable more. She did not perform. She listened, and when she spoke, she said something that moved the conversation forward by some small, useful increment, and then she was quiet again. Twice during the meal her arm brushed mine on the table. Both times she did not move it away. Both times she did not look at me. The contact lasted only as long as the natural movement of her arm required, but I noticed it, and I knew without confirming that she had noticed it too. I thought about the hand at my waist. I thought about it through the salad course, and through the entree, and through the speeches that preceded the awards. And by the time the foundation president stood at the podium and began the introduction for my category, I had thought about it enough that I had begun to understand certain things. I had begun to understand that Selene Marchetti had not happened to be at the bar when I was at the bar. I had begun to understand that her ordering had been unhurried in a way that suggested she had known what she was going to do before I asked her why she was doing it. I had begun to understand that the table I was now seated at had in fact had a vacant seat beside her when I arrived, even though there were 10 places set, and that I was mathematically the 11th person. I had begun to understand that the publishing house's CEO had read the smaller, meaner piece in the publication I refused to name, that she had, by her own admission, read it 6 weeks ago, that this was, in practical terms, 6 weeks during which she had been in possession of information about me, that no professional context required her to know, and she had not done anything with that information until tonight. I had begun to understand that what had happened at the bar had not been a rescue. It had been something else, something more deliberate, something with more architecture than I had at first assumed. I won the award. I had not expected to. I had told myself I had not expected to, partly because I had not, and partly because telling yourself you have not expected something is one of the most reliable ways of surviving the moment when you do not get it. I stood at the small podium with the trophy in my hand, and I gave the speech I had prepared in case. And I thanked my editor and my agent and my publisher, and I did not thank Vivien, and I did not thank Sen, and I sat back down. Sign beside me did not say anything immediately. She let me sit. She let the room return to its noise. She let my publisher come over from her own table to congratulate me, and she let my editor cry a little, and she stayed quiet while all of this happened, the way a person stays quiet who understands that the moment is not theirs. When my publisher and editor had returned to their seats, Selene leaned slightly toward me. She said very quietly, "Your speech was good." I said, "Thank you," she said. The line about finishing a thing without the person you started it with, that was a precise sentence. I had written that line at 3 a.m. approximately a month ago, and I had cut it from the prepared remarks twice and put it back 3 times, and I had read it tonight without certainty about whether I should have included it. I had decided to include it because I had decided I was going to be done apologizing for the existence of certain sentences in my own life. I said, "Thank you for noticing it," she said. "I noticed all of it." I looked at her, she looked back. She did not flinch from the look. She did not redirect it. She held my eyes the way she had held them at the bar, the way she had held them in the conference room 6 months ago, and at the author's luncheon 4 months ago. And I understood with the late and awful clarity that comes to writers eventually that she had been holding my eyes that way every time. I said, "Selene," she said. "Yes," I said. "Are you going to tell me what the more is?" A pause. The room hummed around us. The awards were continuing on the stage, but the speeches had moved to categories that did not concern us, and the table was occupied with its own small conversations. And we had, for one specific window, a private conversation inside a public room. She said, "Not here." I said, "Where?" She said, "That depends on whether you want me to." I held my glass. The sparkling water was warm now, the bubbles long gone. I thought about the bar. I thought about the hand. I thought about 6 weeks of being carried without knowing it in the attention of a woman I had met twice in my professional life, and whom I had not previously understood to be carrying me in any way. I said, "I want you to." She said, "Then we will have the conversation. Not tonight. You have just won an award, and your ex-fiancé is across the room, and you are tired in ways you have not yet noticed. I am not going to ask you to hold a conversation of that weight at the end of a night like this one." I said, "When?" She said, "I am going to send you my number tonight. You will message me when you are ready. It might be tomorrow. It might be next week. It might be next month. I have no schedule for it." I said, "You have a schedule for everything." She said, "I have a schedule for everything except this." The corner of her mouth did the thing again, the thing that might have been a smile if it committed. I said, "That is a generous policy," she said. "It is the only honest one." The awards ended. The applause moved through its final cycle. The room began the slow deconstruction that ballrooms perform at the end of long evenings. Chairs pushed back, jackets retrieved, the polite scattering of people who had been politely contained for hours. I gathered my small purse. I gathered the trophy. Selene rose with me, I said. "I am taking a car home," she said. "I will walk you to the door." Not the car, the door, so that the room sees you are leaving with company. I said, "You have thought about this in detail." She said, "I have thought about a number of things in detail." We walked toward the exit. I felt the room organized itself around our movement the way it had organized itself around her arrival earlier in the evening. I felt Vivien see us. I did not turn to confirm it. I had stopped needing to confirm it. At the door of the ballroom, in the small marble vestibule between the room and the coat check, Selene stopped. She said, "I am sending you my number now." She lifted her phone. I felt mine vibrate in my purse a moment later. The contact transfer was quick and uncomplicated the way she did everything. She said, "Saram." I said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever you decide about the conversation, you should know that the part at the bar was not about Vivien. I want you to be clear about that." I said, "What was it about?" She said, "That is the conversation." I looked at her. I said, "Good night, Selene," she said. "Good night." I retrieved my coat. I walked through the lobby. I got into the car my publisher had ordered, and I rode home through the wet November streets with the trophy in my lap, and the phone in my hand, and the warmth of a stranger's palm, still ghosting at my waist where no one had touched me for 6 months. I did not message Selene that night. I did not message her the next day. I did not message her on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday. I did not message her because I was a writer, and I knew the value of a sentence said at the right time. And I did not yet know what the sentence was going to be. I messaged her on Wednesday evening at 6:14. I wrote I would like to have the conversation. 3 minutes passed, then she wrote back Friday 7. There is a small place on 11th I will send you the address for. If you want a car, I will send one. If you want to come on your own, you may. I wrote, I will come on my own. She wrote, good. She did not write anything else. The conversation closed cleanly the way she closed all conversations. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter of the small new apartment I had rented after October, the one I had chosen because it had a window that opened onto a courtyard with a single ginkgo tree, the one I had been calling in the privacy of my own head, the apartment where I get to start over. I stood at the counter for a long moment. I thought about the hand at my waist. I thought about the line in my acceptance speech. I thought about a CEO who read everything that touched the company, and who had read a piece 6 weeks ago that did not, professionally speaking, have any business landing on her desk, and who had carried me in the periphery of her attention for 6 weeks before producing one specific sentence in a ballroom, about whose architecture she had clearly been thinking for some time. I thought about all of it. I went to bed early. I did not sleep well. I dreamed more than once of a champagne-colored gown and a black suit and the small surgical sentence, "She is with me," and I woke at 5:00 with the specific clarity of a writer who has been given material whether she wanted it or not. Friday came slowly. The small place on 11th turned out to be a restaurant with 12 tables and a bar in the back, the kind of place that did not advertise and did not need to. The kind of place a person took someone when they wanted the conversation to be private and the privacy to be by virtue of the room rather than by any obvious effort. I arrived at 6:58. The host, a young woman with a clean face and quick hands, took my coat without my needing to give a name. She said, "Miss Marchetti is at the back. She said you would be coming." I followed her through the small, crowded room. Selene was at a corner table by a window, the kind of corner that allowed her to see the entire room and the door, and to be seen by both. She was in a black sweater tonight, soft-looking, the kind of person wears when she is not trying to communicate authority, and dark trousers. Her hair was down. It was the first time I had ever seen her hair down. It changed her face by some amount I did not have language for yet. She rose when I came in. She did not extend a hand. She simply waited until I was at the table, and then she sat when I sat, the kind of small, old-fashioned courtesy that some women still performed, and that I had until that moment found vaguely unnecessary. I did not find it vaguely unnecessary in this case. She said I said so. She said thank you for coming. I said thank you for not pressuring me. She said I told you I had no schedule for this. I meant it. The host left a small carafe of water and 2 glasses and disappeared, the way the staff at restaurants of this kind disappeared efficient and discreet, the way I imagined the staff of Solin's life disappeared when she required it. I poured the water. My hands were steady. I had decided on the walkover that I was going to be a writer at this dinner, and not a woman who had been left by her fiancé 6 months ago. And the two were not the same thing. And tonight I needed the writer. I said, "Tell me what the more is." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I have spent 5 days thinking about whether I am sure. I am sure." She looked at me in the warmer light of this restaurant with her hair down and the soft sweater and the unhurried directness she brought to every sentence. Selene Marchetti looked less like a CEO and more like a person, and the difference was the kind of difference that destabilizes a room if you are not braced for it. I was braced for it. I had spent 5 days bracing. She said, "I read your novel 2 summers ago in Manuscript before the acquisition." I said I did not know that. She said, "It is not unusual. I read the manuscripts of acquisitions over a certain advanced threshold. Yours was at that threshold." I said, "All right." She said, "I read your novel and I was not the same after I read it. I want you to understand the language I am using. I am not using the language of a person who appreciated a book. I am using the language of a person whose internal weather changed because of something she read, and who then sat with that change for 2 summers without any context for what to do with it." I said nothing. She said, "I came to the contract signing because I wanted to see what the woman who wrote that book looked like when she was sitting across the table from me. I asked 3 questions about the book at the signing, because I had read it 3 times by then and had 3 things I wanted to know. I came to the author's luncheon because I knew you would be there. I read the piece 6 weeks ago, the smaller, meaner piece, because someone in my office sent it to me unsolicited, and I read it once and then I did not read it again because reading it once was enough to know what I felt about it. I said, "What did you feel about it?" She said, "I felt that someone had been cruel to you in print and that the cruelty had been the second cruelty, and that I had been holding the awareness of you for 2 years already by then, and the awareness sharpened." The room was very quiet. She said, "I came to the gala because I knew you would be there. I requested the seating arrangement at the table. I did not arrange to encounter you at the bar. That was a coincidence of timing. But when I saw you walk in, I was watching for you. And when I saw your ex-fiancée across the room, I made a decision. I said, about the hand." She said, "About the hand, about the sentence, about the table, about all of it." I said, "You did not tell me any of this on the night." She said, "I would not have told you any of this on the night, even if you had asked. You had just won an award and survived an ambush, and you did not need me adding the weight of a 2-year accounting on top of that." I was not going to be the third pressure of the evening. I drank the water. I said, "You are the CEO of the company that publishes my novel." She said, "I know." I said, "This is professionally speaking a problem." She said, "I know." I said, "It is the same problem in every direction. If we have a personal relationship of any kind, it is a conflict of interest. If you make any decision related to me or my book or my contract, that decision is now contaminated. If you do not make any such decisions, you are not doing your job. If you recuse yourself from any such decisions, you are disclosing something I have not yet agreed to disclose." She said, "I know all of this. I have thought about it at length. I have not done anything yet in 2 years that has placed you in a contaminated position. I have not advocated for your acquisition above the natural process. I have not influenced your contract terms. I have not adjusted any decision related to your work for any reason other than its merit. The first thing I ever did that placed any of this in a complicated position was the hand at the bar on Saturday. And the only reason I did that thing was that I had decided I was no longer willing to watch you be ambushed by a person who had hurt you, while standing across the room with the information I had been holding for 2 years. I said, "That is a lot of architecture for a single gesture." She said, "I know I am giving you the architecture because you asked." I sat with this. I said, "What do you want?" She said, "I want to be honest with you about what I have been holding. I want to give you the full information so that you can make any decision you want to make from a position of complete clarity. If you decide that the answer is that this conversation is the end of any extra professional contact between us, I will accept that completely, and I will continue to be a competent CEO of the company that publishes your work, and I will not contact you again outside of professional necessity. If you decide differently, I have already begun the process of removing myself from any decision-making capacity that touches your contract or your imprint." I spoke to my chief operating officer on Monday. The recusal paperwork is drafted. I have not filed it because filing it requires a disclosure I have not yet earned the right to make, and I am not going to make a disclosure on your behalf without your consent, I said. "You drafted recusal paperwork on Monday," she said. "I drafted it on Saturday night after I went home." I looked at her. She said, "I was not going to do any of the things in this conversation if I had not already made it impossible for any of them to harm you institutionally. The paperwork was the prerequisite." I said, "You did the difficult thing first." She said, "I did the difficult thing first." The waiter came over. He set down small plates we had not ordered a courtesy of the kitchen, and he poured the wine that had appeared without my noticing it being delivered, and he disappeared again. I said so. She said yes. I said, "I am going to need a minute." She said, "Take any number of minutes you need." I sat in the corner of a small restaurant on 11th Street, with a CEO across from me who had been carrying me in her attention for 2 summers without my knowing it, who had drafted paperwork on a Saturday night to make sure that the most honest version of her conversation with me would not damage my career. And I thought about Vivien under the chandelier, and I thought about the apartment with the go tree, and I thought about the line in my speech. I thought about all of it for a long time. She let me. She did not interrupt. She did not perform patience. She drank her wine slowly, the same controlled sip from the gala, and she watched the room without watching me. and the absence of pressure in her attention was its own form of attention. I said, "After a long time, I have a question." She said, "Ask." I said, "If I had not asked you tonight, would you have ever told me any of this?" She looked at me. She said, "No." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because the version of this conversation in which you ask is the only one that does not make me a person who imposed something on you. I have been very careful about that. I am not going to be the third cruelty." I said, "The third." She said, "The first was your fiancé. The second was the peace. I will not be the third." I set the wine down. I said, "That is the most decent sentence anyone has said to me in 6 months." She said, "I would like to be a decent sentence in your life, Sam. I would like that very much, but I am not going to manufacture the conditions under which you give me the chance to be one." I looked at her, the hair down, the black sweater, the hands at rest on the table, a woman who had structured the entire architecture of an evening so that the question of whether she existed in my life at all would be entirely my decision made from complete information, without any pressure that she had not first removed. I said. She said, "Yes." I said, "I am not going to give you my answer tonight." She said, "I would think less of you if you did. But I want you to know that I am thinking about it serious." She said, "Thank you for telling me." I said, "You are going to have to tell me a few more things about yourself. Not all at once over time, because right now I know quite a lot about how you have been thinking about me, and almost nothing about who you actually are, and I cannot make a decision without the second." She said, "I will tell you anything you ask." I said, "Anything." She said, "Anything. I will tell you the answers slowly because that is how I tell things, but I will tell you anything." I said, "Where did you grow up?" She said, "A small town in upstate New York. My mother taught piano. My father ran a hardware store. I was the only one of 3 siblings who left." I said, "What was your favorite book at 12? She said, "A Little Princess. I read it 11 times. I will not defend that choice, and I will not apologize for it." I said, "Why publishing?" She said, "Because I read your manuscript 2 summers ago and realized that the company I worked for was capable of making something that mattered to me at a level that nothing else in my professional life had ever reached, and I decided I wanted to be the person responsible for that being possible for other writers." I sat with this. I said that answer was prepared. She said that answer has been prepared for 2 years. I said so. She said yes. I said, "I am going to leave in a few minutes. Not because I am running, because I have had enough information for one night, and I want to walk home and think about all of it without your face across from me, because your face across from me makes it harder to think with the part of my brain I need to use." She said, "Understood." I said, "I will message you when I have thought about it." She said, "I will be here." I stood. She rose. She paid for the dinner I had barely touched. She walked me to the door of the restaurant on the sidewalk. She did not put her hand at my waist. She did not touch me at all. She said, "Good night, Saram." I said, "Good night, Sen." I walked into the wet November street and the cold air hit my face and I started walking north because north was the direction of my apartment and also the direction my body had decided on without consulting me. 2 blocks in, I stopped under a streetlight and stood for a long time with my hands in the pockets of my coat and the warmth of an evening and a sentence and a hand at my waist all sitting in my chest at once. And I understood with the same late awful clarity that I was already in trouble. I had not yet decided what to do about it. But I knew with the certainty writers sometimes have about the shapes of their own stories that I was going to. I walked the rest of the way home, 41 blocks. I did not take a car. I did not check my phone. I walked because the body knew things the head did not. And the body had decided it needed to put 1 foot down and then another foot down for a long enough stretch that the head would catch up. And I had learned over the past 6 months to listen to the body when it offered an instruction. The wet November streets were quiet at that hour. The restaurants were doing their last seatings. The bars on Eve had the soft yellow light that bars have on Fridays before midnight. I passed a flower shop that was already closed, but had left its window display lit, and there were peas in the window in a season that had no business holding peas. And I stopped for a second and thought about how peonies in November cost something specific to the person who had ordered them. And then I kept walking. I thought more or less in straight lines. A woman who had read my novel 2 summers ago in Manuscript, and had not been the same after. A woman who had attended a contract signing, because she wanted to see what I looked like across a table. A woman who had drafted recusal paperwork on a Saturday night, before she was sure she was going to need it. because she had decided that the most honest version of a future conversation with me would not be allowed to damage my career, and the paperwork was the prerequisite she was willing to pay before she would let herself do anything else. A woman who had told me in a small restaurant on 11th that she was not going to be the third cruelty. I did not know walking home whether I was thinking about Selene Marchetti or whether I was thinking about a character who had walked out of the kind of book I would have written if I had been a more generous writer. The line between the two was thinner than I was comfortable with, and I had spent enough years writing fiction to know that when a real person started to look like fiction, it usually meant the person was being more honest than the people around them, not less. I got to my apartment at 12:40. I did not take off the coat for a long time. I sat at the kitchen counter under the small lamp I had bought specifically because it cast a warmer light than the overheads, and I looked at the cocoa tree in the courtyard, and I thought I did not message Selene that night. I did not message her on Saturday. I did not message her on Sunday, although on Sunday I picked up the phone 7 times to draft messages I did not send. On Monday morning I went to my desk and worked on the novel I had been not writing for 6 months. I wrote for 2 hours. The 2 hours were not particularly good, but they were 2 hours, and they were the first 2 hours of new work I had produced since October, and I understood sitting at the desk with the cursor blinking, and a paragraph that was already too long sitting on the screen, that something in me had stopped being held closed by the weight of a thing that had ended. I worked Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. I produced something close to 4,000 words. They were not all keepers. Some of them would be cut, but they were words and they were mine, and they had not been possible last week. On Wednesday evening, I messaged Selene. I wrote, "I would like to see you on Saturday. There is a thing I would like to ask you in person." She wrote back more quickly than the previous message, which was the only piece of information I needed about how she had been spending her week. She wrote Saturday, where I wrote the same place. 7. She clears throat wrote yes. She did not write anything else. The week between Wednesday and Saturday moved the way weeks move when you have given yourself a deadline. I worked at the desk in the morning. I walked in the afternoon. I did not see anyone I had to perform for. I did not check the literary gossip pages for any further versions of the smaller, meaner piece. On Friday afternoon, I bought a sweater I did not need in a shade of dark green I had been thinking about for a while, and I told myself I was buying it for me, which was at least partially true. Saturday came, I wore the green sweater, I walked to 11th. Selene was at the same table, the same corner, the same soft sweater, although in a different color tonight. A deep gray, almost charcoal, the kind of gray that could pass for black at a distance, and revealed itself as gray only when you were close. Her hair was down again. The watch was still on the right wrist. She rose when I came in. She said, "Saram." I said, "Selene." She said, "You look well." I said, "I am well." We sat. The host poured the water. The waiter brought a wine list so lean with the same quiet courtesy as last time deferred to me on whether to order. I said, "I will have a glass of whatever you are having." She said, "I am having the same wine I had last time." I find it difficult to be interesting about wine, and I have stopped pretending. I almost laughed. It was the closest I had come to laughing in front of her, and her eyes registered it, and the corner of her mouth did the thing that almost but did not commit to a smile, and I felt the small specific pleasure of having produced that response in her on purpose. The waiter took the order and disappeared. I said, "I have my question." She said, "I am ready." I said, "I want to know what you would like specifically, not in the abstract, not the careful version, the version where you tell me what you have been imagining for 2 years. She held my eyes. She said, "You are asking me to say it out loud." I said, "Yes." She said, "In a way that has not been edited for your comfort." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to take you to dinner, regularly. I want to know the answers to the questions you ask me, and I want to ask you the questions I have been holding. I want to learn what you are like on a Tuesday morning, when you have not slept, and what you are like at 5 in the afternoon, when the work has gone well, and what you are like at the moment you decide a sentence is finished. I want to be allowed to bring you coffee in a way that is not a transaction, and a meal in a way that is not a meeting, and a book I have read in a way that is not a recommendation. I want to be permitted eventually to put my hand at your waist again in a context that has nothing to do with an ex-fiancée at a gala. I want to be the person you call when you have written something good, and the person you call when you have written something bad. And I want more than anything else to be the person who is paying close enough attention that you do not have to ask me twice for any of it. I sat with this. I said that is a complete sentence. She said I have been editing it for 2 years. I said it shows. She said thank you. The waiter brought the wine. He poured. He left. I said I have an answer. She said I am ready. I said I want all of it, but I want it in stages. I want the first several months to be the version where we are getting to know each other, and where I can change my mind without it costing either of us anything. I want you to file the recusal paperwork before we do anything else. I want there to be no professional contamination of any kind. I want in general to take this slowly enough that I will not look back in a year and feel that I was rebounding into the next thing, because the previous thing had hurt me badly enough that I could not tell the difference. She said, all of that is reasonable. All of that is what I would have asked for if you had not. I said, and I want to tell you something. She said, tell me. I said, I do not entirely trust myself yet about who I am after October. I am going to need you to be patient with me while I find out. I am going to need you to not flinch when I am cold for reasons that have nothing to do with you. And I am going to need you to not interpret my carefulness as rejection. I am going to need you to keep saying the kinds of sentences you said tonight, even when the sentences are inconvenient, because the sentences are how I will know that you are still telling me the truth. She said, I can do all of that. I said, you are very confident about that. She said, I have been preparing for 2 years. Saram, the waiting was not idle. I drank some of the wine. It was in fact a good wine. I had been wrong about wine being a thing I was indifferent to. I said so. She said yes. I said, you can put your hand on the table. She looked at me. I said, not on me, on the table. On the table where my hand is. She moved her hand. It came across the small space and settled near mine. Palm down, fingers loose. The way a hand settles when it is offered rather than imposed. I moved my hand, the small remaining distance, and rested it against hers, back of my hand against the back of hers. Light, the kind of contact that in another life I would have called an accident. It was not an accident. She did not turn her hand. She did not lace her fingers with mine. She left the contact at exactly the level I had said, which was the cleanest thing she could have done. I said, this is the part where you are demonstrating your patience. She said, this is the part where I am happy. I sat with that. I said, we have a lot to do. She said, we have time. We did in fact have time. She filed the recusal paperwork the following Monday. The chief operating officer accepted it without comment. The paperwork was structured so that no decision touching me, or my novel, or my contract, or my imprint would pass through Solin's office for the duration of any extra professional contact between us, with the disclosure logged to the company secretary, and reviewable by the board if necessary. It was by the standards of these things an unusually clean filing. My agent, when she received the courtesy notification, called me on a Tuesday afternoon and asked with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had handled the careers of complicated authors for a long time whether I was all right. I said, I am all right. She said, are you sure? I said, I am more sure than I expected to be. She said, all right, I will not ask again. If you ever need me to ask, you let me know and I will ask. I said, I appreciate you. She said, I appreciate you back. The first months were what I had asked them to be. Selene was patient. She took me to dinner once a week, and then twice a week, and then we stopped counting. She brought me coffee on a Saturday morning in December, which I let her do because I had decided that morning that I was going to start letting people do things for me again. And her face, when I opened the door and let her in without saying anything, did the thing it did under the chandelier, the thing it did at the gala when I said, this is what I want. And I understood that the smallest gestures were going to cost her the most, because she had been holding them the combination longest. I learned things about her. I learned that she got up at 5:20 every morning and ran 4 miles regardless of weather, and that she had been doing this since she was 26 and had survived a year that she did not yet want to tell me about. I learned that she read fiction in the evenings and non-fiction in the mornings, and that she had 3 reading lights in her apartment at different intensities for different times of day. I learned that she could not sing and was unembarrassed about it, and that she could cook precisely 4 things and was unembarrassed about that too. I learned that she had a sister in Boston she called every Sunday, and a brother in Phoenix she called once a month, and that her parents were both still alive in upstate New York, and that she went home for 1 weekend every other month, and helped her father with the inventory at the hardware store because the inventory was too much for him alone now, and he would not accept help from anyone who was not a Marchetti. I learned that she was capable of being tired in a way I had not expected. The first time I saw it was in January on a Wednesday evening when she came over to my apartment after a long board meeting and sat on the couch and did not for the first 8 minutes say anything at all. She just sat there with her shoulders slightly down, the composure not gone but resting, and I watched her and realized that the composure was a thing she put on every morning, the same way she put on the suit, and that being allowed to take it off in front of someone was not a small thing for her. I made tea. I brought it to her without asking what she wanted, because I had learned what she wanted by then. Clear's throat, she said, "Thank you." I said, "You can stay here for as long as you want and not say anything, and I will not require you to perform." She looked at me over the cup of tea. She said, "You are extremely good at this." I said, "At what?" She said, "At noticing the things I have not asked for." I said, "I am a writer." She said, "You are also a person." I said, "I am also a person." She drank the tea. She closed her eyes for 30 seconds. She opened them and was more or less the woman I had met at the gala, composed, present, ready. And the difference between her at the moment of arrival and her now was the difference of a person who had been allowed to put down a thing for 30 seconds. And I understood with the small quiet ache of it that I had become in the architecture of her life, the place where she was permitted to put a thing down. It was a heavier responsibility than I had anticipated. It was also one I wanted. We did not for a long time do more than the hand at the table. This was a deliberate choice on my part and a respected choice on hers. I had told her I needed stages, and she had agreed to stages, and stages was what she gave me. We sat near each other on couches, and we walked close enough that our coats brushed in the cold, and once at the door of my apartment in late January. She leaned in to say good night, and her face was close to mine for one extended second, and her hand came up to my jaw just briefly, just the warm side of her thumb against the corner of my jaw, and then she stepped back and said good night and left. And I stood with my hand on the door for 3 full minutes after she had gone, because the corner of my jaw had not been touched by another person for 7 months. And the part of me that registered the fact that it had been touched again had not yet caught up. The first kiss happened in February. It was not at the door, it was not in a restaurant. It was in the courtyard of my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, in the cold gray light of a winter that had been longer than usual under the cocoa tree that had no leaves, but still looked like the tree that had made me sign the lease. I had been telling her about the tree, about why I had chosen the apartment, about the specific small pact I had made with myself in October, that the tree was going to be the first decision of the next chapter, and that everything else would follow from it. I told her this with my breath visible in the cold, and my hands in the pockets of my coat, and she listened the way she listened to everything completely with no agenda and no commentary. When I finished, she said, I said yes. She said, may I? I said yes. She put one hand at my jaw and one hand at the small of my back, and she kissed me. It was patient. It was not frantic. It was the kind of kiss that a woman who had been editing a sentence for 2 years gave when she was finally allowed to say it. The cold air, the ginkgo tree, the fact that she did not lean any of her weight into me, did not press, did not take anything beyond what I had given. The fact that when she stepped back, she kept the hand at my jaw for a beat longer, and her thumb just once moved slowly across my cheekbone and her eyes did not leave mine. I said, so lean. She said yes. I said, do that again. She did it again. The second one was less patient and more honest, and we stood in the courtyard for a long time until the light shifted in a way that meant the afternoon was ending. And we went up to my apartment and made tea and sat on the couch, and did not that night do anything beyond what I had agreed to in stages. But the stages had moved, and we both knew it, and neither of us pretended otherwise. She did not stay over that night. She did not stay over for a long time after that night. The not staying was again deliberate, a thing I had asked for and a thing she had given me. The first night she stayed. In late March, she stayed because I asked her to, and the asking was the part I had been waiting until I could do without flinching. And when I did it, she nodded once and said yes, the way she said yes to everything I had asked her for, which was to say simply, without making a thing of it. In April, the publishing house's spring catalog launch happened. It was by tradition an industry event, the kind of thing where the entire literary apparatus of New York gathered in a hotel ballroom and ate small, expensive food and pretended to be glad to see each other. I was for the first time in my career on the catalog as a major spring title, The paperback release of the novel with a new afterword I had written over the winter and a tour attached. So attended in her capacity as CEO. I attended in my capacity as author. The recusal paperwork had been on file for 5 months. It was visible on the internal record of any board member who chose to look at it. It was not, however, something either of us had publicized, because the publicity of these things is its own particular politics, and we had agreed with the patient quietness. We had agreed on most things that we would let the disclosure speak for itself when it needed to. We arrived separately. She was already in the ballroom when I came in, standing near the front of the room with my publisher and the chair of the foundation board, and she did not, when I entered, walk over to me. She let me work the room the way authors work rooms at their own catalog events. She let me have the moment that was professionally mine. I worked the room. I shook the hands. I made the small, careful jokes that authors make at their catalog events. I did all of this with the steady spine that I had not had at the gala in November. And I did it with the small, quiet awareness, sitting underneath everything else, that there was a woman across the room whose hand I would be allowed to hold later, and the awareness was its own form of armor. Vivien was not there. I had checked the guest list. She was not on it. She had moved to London in February as planned, and she had stopped being a person whose schedule I tracked. What was there, however, was a woman I had not anticipated. I saw her at the bar. She was Selene's age, maybe a little older. She was tall with her hair pulled back the way Selene used to pull her hair back before she had started leaving it down for me, and she was wearing a navy blue suit that was the kind of suit a person wore when they wanted to communicate professional gravity. I did not recognize her face. I recognized, however, the way she was looking at Selene from across the room. It was the way Selene used to look at me from across the rooms in the months before the gala, when I had not yet known I was being looked at. I went to the bar. The woman saw me coming. Her eyes registered me with the small specific recognition of a person who had been told somewhere along the way what I looked like. I said, "I do not believe we have met," she said. "We have not. I am Tess." She said this without a last name, the way some women say their first names when they are accustomed to being recognized without further information. And I noted this and filed it. I said, "Sam." She said, "I know." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Selene mentioned you some time ago." I said, "How long ago?" A pause. She looked at me. The look was not unfriendly. It was in fact the kind of look that women sometimes give each other when they have correctly identified that they are about to have a conversation neither of them was planning on having. She said 18 months ago, approximately. I said, "And what were the circumstances under which she mentioned me?" She said we had been seeing each other for some months. She told me on a Tuesday evening that she had been carrying an awareness of someone whose work she had read, and that the awareness had reached a point where she was not able to be honest with me about the fact that the someone was not me. She ended things that night. She did not tell me your name. I learned your name on my own. Later, when your novel came out and the company began the marketing, I absorbed this. I said, "Tess." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because I came tonight specifically to find out whether she was still carrying the awareness or whether she had moved past it. I have my answer. I have had my answer since the moment she walked in and looked at the door once, and then again, and then a third time, and her face did a thing it never did when she was looking at me. I am not going to do anything with the answer except what I am doing now, which is to tell you that she is, in my experience, the most honest person I have ever been involved with, and that she does not carry awarenesses lightly. I am telling you this because I think you should know, and because nobody else is going to tell you, and because I would have wanted to know if our positions had been reversed." I looked at her. I said, "That is a generous thing to come here to do." She said, "It is a generous thing on the surface. Underneath it is also a thing I needed to do for me. I would like to be the kind of person who can stand at a bar and say accurate things to a stranger about a woman I used to be in love with, without the saying costing me anything I am not willing to pay. Tonight is the test of that. I appear to be passing." I said, "You are passing." She said, "Thank you. I will leave you to your evening. It was very nice to meet you, Sam. I wish you a good catalog." She walked away. She did not look back. She crossed the room with the long, even stride of a woman who had decided something, and she left the ballroom approximately 4 minutes later, and I did not see her again. I stood at the bar for a long minute with the new information settling. Selene came over. She did not come over because she had seen Tess at the bar with me. She came over because she had been working the room in her capacity as CEO, and her capacity as CEO had brought her on its natural circuit to the bar where her author was standing. She arrived at the bar, ordered a sparkling water for me without asking, ordered a wine for herself, and turned with the same small angle of her body she had used at the gala, which had the effect of placing me at the center of her attention without any contact required. She said, "You are quiet," I said. "I just had a conversation with a woman named Tess." She did not flinch. Her face did one careful thing. A single small compression around the eyes. The kind of compression a person makes when they have correctly identified the conversation that has just been had and are now organizing themselves around it. And then her face was again the face she had brought to the room. She said, "I see." I said, "She told me that you ended things with her 18 months ago, because of an awareness you had been carrying." She said, "That is accurate." I said, "You did not tell me that." She said, "I did not tell you that because I did not think it was a story that belonged to me alone to tell. Tess is a private person. The version of that ending was hers as much as mine. I would not have told you about it without her permission, and I had not asked for her permission because I did not want to put her in a position of being asked for permission about something she had moved on from." I said, "So?" She said, "Yes." I said, "That is one of those answers that is technically correct and emotionally unsatisfying." She said, "I know." I said, "Were you ever going to tell me?" She said, "Eventually. When the timing was right, when we had reached a stage at which the disclosure would not look like it had a strategic purpose. I have been thinking about how to tell you for several months. Tess told you tonight, which I did not anticipate, but which I respect and which I am in some way grateful for, because it means you have the information now, without me having had to choose the moment." I looked at her. I said so. She said yes. I said, "You ended a relationship 18 months ago because of me." She said, "I ended a relationship 18 months ago because I had become a person who could not be honest with the person I was with. The reason I could not be honest was related to you. The decision to end the relationship was about my own honesty. I want you to hear the distinction." I said, "I hear the distinction." She said, "Good." I said, "It is, however, a lot of information for a Wednesday night." She said, "I know." I said, "I would like to leave with you." She said, "You have not done your full circuit of the room." I said, "I have done enough of it." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I am sure." She said, "Then I will get our coats." We left the catalog event together. We had by that point stopped pretending that there was a version of the evening at which we did not leave together, and the room had filed the information, and had decided, as rooms decide these things, to be polite about it. My publisher had given me one specific look earlier in the evening, the small composed look that meant she had already known, and had decided not to make me explain, and I was grateful to her. And I would tell her that later in a way that did not require either of us to make a thing of it. We walked to the corner. The car Selene had ordered was waiting. We got in. In the back of the car, she did not put her hand at my waist. She did not put her hand anywhere. She sat at her side of the seat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at me and she waited. I said, "You ended a relationship for me before I knew you existed." She said, "I ended a relationship for the truth. You were separately the truth." I said, "That is the kind of sentence that should have been in the small restaurant on 11th. She said, "You did not ask me at the small restaurant on 11th. I said, "I should have asked more questions." She said, "You asked the questions you needed to ask. You asked the questions a person asks when they are protecting themselves correctly. You did not ask the questions that came later because the later questions were not yet relevant to the decision you were making." I said, "Selene." She said, "Yes." I said, "I am not angry." She said, "I know." I said, "I am, however, surprised." She said, "I know that, too." I said, "And I am going to need you going forward to err on the side of telling me things sooner rather than later, even when the things are not strictly mine to know, even when the timing feels imperfect. Because the alternative where Tess shows up at a catalog event and tells me the things you have been deciding the timing of is a worse outcome than any version of you telling me yourself," she said. "Understood," I said. "Say it the way you mean it." She said, "I will tell you things sooner rather than later. I will not edit my honesty for the timing. I will trust you to absorb difficult information without it costing us, because you have in fact demonstrated that you can do that. I am sorry for the specific way you learned about Tess." I said, "Apology accepted." She said, "Thank you." The car moved through the wet April streets. We did not say anything else for several minutes. At some point, my hand found her hand in the dark of the back seat, and her fingers this time laced with mine, and the two of us rode home that way without speaking, and the silence was the silence of a thing that had survived a small, specific test. She came up with me. She stayed. In May, I finished the new draft of the second novel. I had been working on it steadily since January. The novel was different from the one Selene had read in Manuscript 2 summers ago. It was in some ways a more honest novel because the woman writing it was a more honest woman. Selene did not read the draft. I had asked her not to, because the recusal paperwork covered any decisions related to my work, and any reading she did of the manuscript would have in some technical sense complicated the recusal architecture, and we had agreed that we were going to be religious about the architecture. She did, however, ask me one question on the night I finished it. She said, "How does it feel?" I said, "It feels like a thing that is mine." She said, "Good." She did not ask anything else. In June, on a Saturday morning, she made me coffee in the kitchen of my apartment and brought it to me at the desk where I was reading proofs of someone else's book that I had agreed to blurb. She set the coffee down and did not interrupt. She kissed the top of my head. She went back to the kitchen. I sat with the proofs for another minute, and then I put them down and I went into the kitchen and I said, "Selene." She said, "Yes." I said, "I love you." She did not flinch. She did not perform. She did not, in fact, do anything dramatic at all. She put down the dish towel she had been holding. She walked across the small kitchen to where I was standing in the doorway. She took my face in both of her hands the way she had taken my face in the courtyard in February, and she said very quietly into the small space between us, "I love you back. I have loved you back for 2 years. I have loved you back since before I knew what you sounded like out loud. I love you back specifically and entirely. And I am very glad you said it first, because I had decided I would wait until you said it, and I had been wondering for some time now when that would be." I said, "You were going to wait forever." She said, "I was going to wait as long as it took." Forever was inside the range. I said, "That is a very Selene answer." She said, "I know." We stood in the kitchen for a long time. The coffee got cold. Neither of us cared. In September, almost a year after the gala, we attended the Foundation's literary fundraiser again. It was the same ballroom. It was the same chandelier. It was the same approximate room, give or take some shuffling of the Foundation's programming. I wore black again. Not the same black dress, a different black dress. This one with the back slightly lower, and the sleeves 3/4 and a small piece of detailing at the shoulder that I had thought about for some time before deciding it was the right amount of attention to call to myself. I pinned my hair up. I took a car to the venue. I went with Swine. We arrived together. We walked into the ballroom together. We were placed by the Foundation at the same table because there was no longer any pretense about how the seating should go. The publishing house had at some point in the spring made the disclosure formal. The board had at some point in the spring signed off. The recusal paperwork had been adjusted from temporary to permanent. The professional architecture had been the architecture all along, and now, in September, it was simply the public version of itself. Vivien was not there. She had not, as it turned out, been invited back. The Foundation had its own quiet politics about which prior attendees it required to attend in subsequent years. And after some review of the prior gala's incidents, they had quietly chosen, for the comfort of the room, to leave certain names off the invitation list. The room saw us come in. The room had seen us come into many rooms by then. The room had filed all of the information. I worked the room in my capacity as a writer with a book on the spring catalog, and a paperback that had done well, and a second novel that was about to be announced. Selene worked the room in her capacity as the CEO of the parent company, which had been her job all along, and which she did with the quiet efficiency she had always done it with. At one point around halfway through the evening, I was at the bar with my publisher, and Selene was across the room with 2 Foundation board members, and she looked over at me through the crowd and her eyes found my eyes, the way they always found my eyes now without searching, because the looking had become. By then something her body did, the way her body breathed. She lifted her glass approximately half an inch. It was not a toast. It was not a signal. It was simply the small private gesture of a woman acknowledging in a public room that she had located the person she was looking for. I lifted my glass back. My publisher beside me said, "You look extremely well, Saram." I said, "I am extremely well," she said. "I am very glad." I said, "Me too." Later that evening in the taxi on the way home with the trophy I had this time not won, but had been a finalist for, and which therefore meant nothing concrete, except that I had been seen as a serious enough person to be considered. I leaned my head against Soan's shoulder, and I said very quietly, "A year ago you put your hand on my waist in this room." She said, "I remember." I said, "You did not have to." She said, "I have not done one single thing in a year that I had to do, Saram. Every part of it has been a thing I wanted." I said, "I know." She said, "Good." I said, "I want you to know one thing." She said, "What?" I said, "I am not the same woman you read in Manuscript 2 years ago. I am not the woman you carried in your awareness for 18 months. I am not even the woman who walked into the ballroom in November. I am someone newer than that. I am still becoming her. I want you to know that I plan to keep becoming her, and that I plan to do it next to you if you are willing." She turned in the seat. She put her hand at my jaw the way she had at the courtyard, the way she did now when she wanted me to listen to something specific. She said, "Saram." I said, "Yes." She said, "I would like to keep meeting all of the women you become. I have been excellent at it so far. I do not plan to stop." I said, "That is again a complete sentence." She said, "I have been editing it since June." I said, "It shows." She said, "Thank you." She kissed me in the back of the taxi. The driver, who had seen many things in many years of driving, did not appear to notice. The wet September streets moved past the window. The chandelier of the ballroom was by then 2 avenues behind us, and the small private architecture of a life that had begun with one careful sentence in a public room was by then a year old and stable, and most importantly, ours. In November, 2 years after the night Vivien had ended things at the kitchen island in the apartment we had bought together, I was at my desk in the small new apartment with the goko tree, working on the 3rd novel, when Selene let herself in with the key I had given her in July. She set down a paper bag from the place on 11th, which had become over the course of the year a place we did not have to discuss before going to. She said, "Dinner." I said, "5 more minutes." She said, "I will be in the kitchen." I finished the paragraph. I saved the draft. I went to the kitchen. She had taken off her coat. Her hair was down. She was unpacking the small containers from the paper bag in the unhurried way she did everything. She looked up when I came in. She smiled, the full version, the version that committed. She said, "How was the work today?" I said, "The work was good." She said, "Tell me about it." I told her about it. She listened. She did not interrupt. She finished unpacking the food. We sat at the small table by the window that looked out onto the courtyard, and the goko tree, which had survived another November, was still there, and we ate. After dinner, she did the dishes. She had decided sometime in the spring that doing the dishes was her contribution to evenings at my apartment, and I had decided at approximately the same time to let her. She did them efficiently. She put everything where it belonged. She knew by then where everything belonged. She came back to the table. She said, "Saram." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have a question." I clear's throat said, "Ask." She said, "How would you feel about looking at apartments together in the spring?" I sat with this. I said, "Selene." She said, "Yes." I said, "Are you proposing that we live together?" She said, "I am asking how you would feel about looking at apartments. The looking is the question. The living is separately a question which we can ask later if the looking goes well." I said, "You have rehearsed this." She said, "I have rehearsed this since August." I said, "It shows." She said, "Thank you." I said, "I would like to look at apartments with you in the spring." She said, "Good." She took my hand across the table. She did not lace her fingers with mine. She rested her palm against mine the way she had at the small restaurant on 11th, on the night I had given her the answer. She looked at me with the same steady attention she had brought to the bar at the gala on the night. A hand at my waist had changed the architecture of 2 lives. I looked at her back. I thought very briefly about the woman who had stood at the bar a year ago, with a champagne flute going cold against her fingers, watching her fiancé under a chandelier, rehearsing 4 versions of a sentence, none of which she had used. I thought about how much of a stranger that woman was to me now. I thought about how the strangeness was not a loss. I said, "So?" She said, "Yes." I said, "This was the right answer." She said, "I know." I said, "I want you to know that I know." She said, "Thank you." We sat at the table by the window for a long time. The goko tree was still there. The apartment was still mine for now. The life I had was still being built slowly. The way she had told me on a Tuesday evening in February that real things were built, which was the way she built everything. Outside, the city was wet again. November in this city was, I had come to understand, going to keep being wet for as long as I lived here. The wetness was no longer a thing I had to brace against. It was just the weather. And the weather was, this time, a thing I was inside of with someone else. And the someone else was the woman who had decided 2 years ago in a quiet office on the 32nd floor of a building I worked in, only contractually that she was going to read a manuscript carefully, and then keep reading, and then keep paying attention. And then when the time came, she was going to put her hand on the curve of my waist in a public room, and she was going to say a sentence of exactly 4 words, and the 4 words were going to be true. She is with me. She had said it before she had any right to say it. She had earned the right by saying it. She had spent a year since, demonstrating that the sentence had been honest the whole time. I leaned across the small table. I kissed her. It was the kiss of a woman who had taken 2 years of someone else's careful patience and had decided finally that she was going to start meeting it with her own. She kissed me back. In the courtyard, the goko tree did the small movement it did in November wind. The light from the kitchen lamp fell across the table where our hands were resting. The new draft was saved on the desk in the next room. The recusal paperwork was filed and permanent. The apartments we would look at in the spring were somewhere in the city already standing, waiting for 2 specific women to come in and walk through them and decide. I thought with the late and grateful clarity that comes to writers eventually, this is the part of the story where the ending is also the beginning. I had not until that moment believed that such an ending existed. I believed it now. I kissed her again just to make sure she was still there. She is in fact still there.